Okay, we are on the home stretch. 2 more types of tests to go, and this will round out all of the required inference procedures and models for the course. There are more out there, but those required as part of the AP curriculum are limited really to 4 groups. So let's take a quick look at those. So the inference models we've covered so far are the normal model, which we use for categorical data. So these are our 1 proportion Z and 2 proportion Z procedures. So it involves categorical data, proportions, percentages of the whole, and 1 or 2 proportions. So we can do a 1 proportion Z test, 2 proportion Z test, or confidence interval. Then we moved into the T model in the last unit that we studied, and the T model we use when we do inference procedures, hypothesis testing, or confidence intervals for quantitative data. We can use it for 1 sample or 2 sample means, and we've looked at 2 independent samples and also paired samples. So there were actually 3 different procedures in that unit that involved the T model. And then the linear regression model, which also uses T, is our Chapter 26 procedures, which we're going to wrap up with here in about a week or so. And then the last, which is actually the one that we're going to look at today, or start today, is the chi-square model. The Greek letter chi kind of looks like an X, and then of course we put a square on it, so we pronounce this chi-square. And that is our test statistic or test statistic label. In the T model we use T, and in the normal model we would use Z. So we have 3 different names of procedures: the Z procedures, the T procedures, and the chi-square procedures. The chi-square model is used when you have categorical data, and it tacks on sort of to this normal model up here, where the normal model loses, where we can't use it anymore, I guess, where it kind of runs out of space with 1 or 2 proportions. The chi-square picks up for situations where you have more than 2 proportions. So if you are doing an experiment and you have 3 treatment groups and your observations are percentages, when you have a categorical variable, if you had 3 treatment groups, you would need to move into a chi-square test in order to compare your treatment groups. Because the normal model will only go up to 2 treatment groups, only up to 2 proportions. So where that one fails to continue, this one picks up. Where the 2 sample means or the paired means for the T model lose track, something called ANOVA picks up, and ANOVA is going to deal with more than 2 means. We do not study that in AP statistics. It would be the next logical place to go at the end of the course if we had time just to explore things. I have seen college students come back and be working with ANOVA. On the calculator, it's a super simple procedure, but the setup, the formulas behind it are pretty overwhelming. If you had to do the work by hand, it's several pages of work. So the ANOVA, the tack on to the T model, just isn't part of the AP curriculum, but it might be something you would see in a college level course beyond this one. So we're going to look at the chi-square model. Some of you who've had AP biology have seen chi-square models before, because that is one of the procedures that is AP biology curriculum required. Maybe if you've seen it before, this will tie into what you learned there, maybe make it make more sense than it did before. So moving on to the next page, how is the chi-square model different from the normal and T models? Well, the biggie is that it's not symmetric. So chi-squared is not symmetric. Well, it has a left bound of 0, which means there are no negatives. Because let's do some algebra here. If you square a number, you always get a positive number or a non-negative number. You could get a 0, but definitely can't get a negative if you square a number. So there are no negatives involved. So you have a distinct left bound, and then you have a one-tailed right-tailed distribution. So the picture is going to look like this. And so over here is 0, and then how skewed it is dependent upon what the circumstance, what your distribution is, what your context is. And we don't normally draw the picture of the chi-square curve when we do inference procedures. We just do the number crunching. So we don't really have to worry about how skewed it is, exactly where that hump is. The calculator is going to take care of all the number crunching for us, and we won't worry about what the picture looks like. Other differences is that distances between values on this curve are not measured in standard deviations. You do not compute a standard deviation in a chi-square test. So measures of spread are not the same as they are for the other models. And the thing is, we won't really worry about it because it's not symmetric. It's not like we're looking for how far we are from the center anymore. We're actually looking for how far our observation is in the tail, because the farther out in this tail our observation goes, the more unusual it is, and the more likely we are to reject a null hypothesis. So it's sort of the same ideology that we used even for a two-tailed test. And it's difficult because we don't really always know just how skewed this thing is. It's difficult to quantify when a chi-squared is too big. So difficult to quantify how big, man, that's not readable, how big the chi-squared must be to be considered unusual or statistically significant. So we're going to rely on computations, formulas, calculator, to give us a p-value, and we're going to judge statistically significant. We're going to judge how unusual, how too big that chi-squared is based on a p-value that will be computed by the calculator. Okay, there are 3 types of chi-square tests, and they are all about what kind of relationship you're looking for. So we're gonna break these up into 2 groups. We're gonna break these up into group 1, the goodness of fit test. The goodness of fit test, you generally start with a single list of numbers, okay? And when you get to the other 2, the test of homogeneity and the test of independence, you usually start with a two-way table, or we call that a contingency table in the earlier chapters. So there's a two-way table. You put the table in the calculator, and the calculator will actually do all the computation for you. We will learn test of homogeneity and test of independence in the next lesson. So we're going to kind of skirt over those for now and deal with just this first one, the goodness of fit test, which is the one that you would have seen in AP Biology if you've already taken that class. So goodness of fit, as you know, grammatically incorrect as that is, it's still the name of the test. We sometimes abbreviate that the GOF test. The goodness of fit test compares the distribution of observed outcomes, so an observed list, for a single categorical variable like color, could be eye color, could be M&M color, it could be a region that certain animals live in, could be the type of bone structure that certain creatures have, which is why you would see that in biology. For a single categorical variable, to the expected outcomes predicted by a probability model. So we're going to take observed outcomes and compare it to expected outcomes. Just like we did before, you're just going to have more than 2 of them now. And that's why you need a different type of test, because it's not as simple as just comparing a single observation to some hypothesized proportion that you start with, that some assumption you start with. and we see if the model is viable. So we see if what we observe looks like what we expected to see, and the more different the observations are from the expectations, the more likely we're going to be to reject a hypothesis. So we start with one variable, one sample. So goodness of fit, you have one variable, like M&M color, and one sample to test against some probability model, some norm, some hypothesized set of values. Okay, so we're going to jump right in to actually doing a goodness of fit test to see how that looks different. You'll notice that these are all tests. There are no confidence intervals in the chi-square world. We don't even compute those, generally because you don't have a two-tailed distribution. So you're not looking at the middle percentage. There is no middle percentage in a chi-square test, or in a chi-square distribution. So we only do testing. So that eliminates half of the possible inference procedures that we would have expected to learn. So we just learned to run the test. So that's going to narrow our work down quite a bit. Okay, so we're going to start with an example. We have an article about the California lottery that appeared in a newspaper back in 1999 that gave the following information on age distribution of adults in California. 35% between 18 and 34 years old. So we have that, those categories down here. And those are categories, which makes this categorical data. 51% are between 35 and 64 years old, so that's the second category, and 14% are 65 years or older. So we see here a single variable. There's one variable, and that variable is age range. And instead of it being quantitative and we have a bunch of observations of how old each person that was studied is, we just have percentages of the population. So we're in categorical variable world because of how we're measuring the data. So there's one variable and it's the age ranges. And there are three categories. So we wouldn't be able to use a 1 proportion, 2 proportion z-test on this, because if we did use these percentages, 35%, 51%, 14%, there's 3 percentages there. And our z-tests only are built to do 1 proportion or 2 proportions. So because we have more than 2 categories, we have to move on to the chi-square test to deal with it. The article also gave information on the age distribution of those who purchased lottery tickets. Okay, so they have some people in the population who purchased lottery tickets. Okay, here's the rest of the information. Suppose the data resulted from a random sample of 200 lottery ticket purchasers. So there's one sample of 200 people that was taken. So we have one variable, we have one sample. So that puts us in goodness of fit territory. Based on the sample data, so these are the actual observations from those 200 people, is it reasonable to conclude that one or more of these age groups buys a disproportionate share of lottery tickets? Here's the idea. We have the proportion of people in each age group in the population. We have some proportions of people who bought lottery tickets. If we look at percentages here, if this is out of 200, 36 out of 200 would be 18%. So 18% between 18 and 34, as opposed to 35% of people in general in that category. 130 out of 200 is 65%. So 65 in that age group percent bought lottery tickets. But there are only 51% of the population in that age group. So there's a lower proportion of this younger age group buying lottery tickets than we would have expected. There's a higher proportion in that middle age group buying lottery tickets, according to this sample. And then 34 out of 200 is 17%. And 17% above 65 years old is higher than the percentage of people in that age group. So the relative frequencies in the sample do not match the frequencies of the actual age groups in general. The question is it a big enough difference between the percentages here and the percentages from the population itself for us to think that a disproportionate share of lottery tickets are purchased by any of those age groups? Are what we're seeing here percentages different than these percentages? That's what we want to know. So we need to run a test, and this one is a chi-squared goodness of fit test. Okay, so we need to write some hypotheses. Okay, so when we wrote hypotheses for one or two proportions, we wrote things like P is equal to 30%, or P is not equal to 30%. Or we might have, if we were comparing two groups, said P sub 1 minus P sub 2 equals 0, and P sub 1 minus P sub 2 is greater than 0. So we would have used variables, P's for a proportion of the population. Well, we have multiple proportions. We have 3 here. And in some situations, you might have more categories. You might have 4 categories. You might have 6 categories. You might have 10 categories. How many categories, whether it be age groups or M&M colors or different species of animals, whatever the situation is, whatever your variable is, you may have several different proportions. So it's not as simple as just labeling them all P's and then writing an equation about how they're related. So for chi-square tests, we normally write hypotheses in words. Okay, and the words really we get from the question that we started with. So if I look back at the question, I want to know if it's reasonable to conclude that one or more of these age groups buys a disproportionate share of lottery tickets. Now, in the null hypothesis, I'm assuming that nothing interesting is going on, that the percentage of people buying lottery tickets match the percentage of people that exist. So I would say that they don't buy a disproportionate share, or that they buy a proportional share. So I'm going to try to use the wording in that last sentence to word my hypotheses. So I'm going to start with the null, and I want to say that each of those age groups buys a proportional share of lottery tickets. So we're going to say all age groups buy a proportional share of lottery tickets. And then the alternative would be that they don't, or that they buy a disproportionate share. So a lot of times all you have to do is put a do not or not in the second sentence, and you have your alternative. So all age groups do not buy a proportional share of lottery tickets. So you get your context usually from the last sentence in your problem stem, and your null should be that there's nothing interesting going on. Your observations are similar to or look like your population, your expectations, and then stick a not in for the alternative. All right, so just notes to self out here to the side. These are always in sentence form. Okay, now conditions. Totally different than the conditions we had for z-tests and t-tests. So there are 3. And let's just go ahead and throw those in. The very first one is that your data have to be counts. So this is where things get kind of weird. In 1 proportion and 2 proportion z-tests, we use percentages of the whole. We use proportions, 25%, 55%, 33%, 0.22, 0.07, whatever your percentage was. Because we're comparing multiple groups, more than 2 groups this time, that gets super complicated. So we actually do chi-squares using the counts, the actual frequencies. So we do frequencies instead of relative frequencies. So the first thing we ask ourselves is the data that we collected in counts. And if we look back at our table, we have frequencies of 36, 130, and 34. If those aren't already counts, you can change them back to counts. If those were percentages, you could have multiplied by 200, your sample size, to change them to counts. So make sure your data are counts. If they aren't already, you fix them up so that they are. Data are counts, check. Those are frequencies, not relative frequencies. Okay, as always, we need an unbiased sample. If we don't have an unbiased sample, we don't have a correct picture of what's coming off the population, all bets are off. Nothing's going to work. So, did we get a random sample? It said so in the problem stem. So, a random sample of adults was taken. Okay, check, it said so. And then the third one is the brand new one, and it's a sample size issue. The third one's always a sample size issue. And for chi-square test and t-test, it was an issue of normality. Do we have a sampling distribution that's approximately normal? Well, chi-square isn't normal. Chi-squared is skewed right. So we need a whole different check here. And the check here is still about sample size, which boils down to, do you have enough expected counts in each category for every category to get properly represented? So in our for each category, we need to have at least 5 expected successes, at least 5 things in each category expected. So this one's always going to be the same. All expected counts are at least 5. Now I can't check that off yet because I don't even know what my expected counts are yet. I have my observations, but I don't have the expected ones, the ones from the actual population. So that has to be accompanied with some numbers, okay? And let's make a note out here before we move on to that. Always these 3, okay? So expected counts, where are we going to get those? Well, we've got a couple choices. We could make a new table out here to the side, or we could actually work with the table that's already there. So I'm going to go back and work with the table that's already there. So these are the frequencies for each age group. These are the observed, okay? So these are observed frequencies. I'm going to add a column right here, just kind of section it off, and I'm going to do expected counts, or expected frequencies. Counts is a shorter word, so I'm going to write that instead of frequencies. And I'm going to compute how many we should have if a proportional number of people in each age group buy lottery tickets. So if we have in the state of California 35% of adults are between 18 and 34, then 35% of those 200 people sampled should have bought lottery tickets. So 35% of the 200 people is 70. So they're in a perfect world, if there really are a proportional number of people in each age group buying lottery tickets, in a perfect world, 70 people should have bought lottery tickets. We only had 36, which means it looks like, according to the sample, that younger age group is less likely to play the lottery. Maybe they know some statistics. They know they're not supposed to win. Let's hope so. In the second category, we have ages 35 to 64, and there's 51% of those. So 51% of these 200 people in the sample, which is 102 people, are what we expected to buy lottery tickets. 130 is larger than what we expected it to be, which means that middle age group looks to be more likely to buy lottery tickets than that younger age group. That's not proportional to the sizes of the population. And then the last group, 14% are between 65 and 100,000. So 150, however old people get, 120. 14% times 200 is 28. So we expected 28 people from that oldest age group to buy lottery tickets, and 34 did. So that's not a huge difference. That category is the least interesting of the three. The first two are definitely much more different from what we expected them to be. And what we want to do is we want to compare each of these observed and expected to sort of see the size of the differences. And the bigger those differences are, the more likely we are to have an unusual or a disproportionate number of people buying lottery tickets in each age group, and the more likely we are to reject the null that nothing interesting is going on. Okay, so this work has to be done, and check to make sure that these numbers 70, 102, and 28, those are all at least 5, and they are. So before you check off this last one, you have to actually look at those counts. And typically you have to do some computation to get that done, because they almost always come at you in percentages, and you have to change them to counts so that you can compare and you can check this condition. And you're also going to need those counts when you do your mechanics in the next step. Okay, so the name of the procedure, the last piece of these first two steps of a hypothesis test, the same as always, is the name of the test, which is a chi-square goodness of fit test. So we will use and you can use the variable, you can use the symbol, or you can write the word chi-squared. Use a chi-square goodness of fit test. How good does your observations fit what you expected it to be? That's where the name comes from. It's just, that would make, your really, really tough English teachers want to just throw something. All right, so first two steps, same as what we're accustomed to, but because the nature of the beast, the model is different, it looks very different than what we've been doing before. Okay, so step 3 is mechanics. Now, the lovely thing about mechanics is it's just a formula to substitute into. Calculator will do number crunching as needed. We do not have to draw a picture, partly because we don't actually know how skewed that chi-square model is for a particular situation. So the expectation is that we don't worry about drawing it. So there are 3 things that typically must be communicated in the mechanics. Degrees of freedom, the actual chi-square test statistic showing how to calculate that test statistic, and the p-value. So those are the same things we would have had to provide for a t-test in the last unit, but the formula looks quite a bit different. So first of all, let's deal with the degrees of freedom. So a note about degrees of freedom. So degrees of freedom is 1 less than the number of categories. So we had 3 categories, and we subtract 1, and we get 2. There were 3 age groups. 3 age groups, okay? So number of groups, number of categories, number of observations in the table is another way you can think of it. How many numbers did you have in that table? 3 of them. And then you subtract 1. Alright, so we have 2 degrees of freedom. And we must show that computation in the mechanics. So we're going to go down here and we're going to write df equals 3 minus 1 or 2. So 2 degrees of freedom. So obviously the more categories you have, the more variation you have to deal with, the bigger your degrees of freedom get, and you'll have to communicate that always when you do your mechanics. Then we need an actual test statistic. So if we were doing a normal model, or if we were using a t-model, the next thing we would do is compute a z-score or a t-score. We need a chi-square score or a chi-square test statistic. So where do I find formulas for test statistics? in the formula book. Ding, 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 ding. Page 1 in the formula book is what we've got to look for. So here we go. Page 1 of the formula book. Very bottom. Under sampling distributions and inferential statistics, we have our standardized test statistic that we use for Z and T models. Confidence interval structure, we don't need that here because chi-squared is a different animal. But at the very bottom we have very explicitly a chi-square statistic. And one of the nice things about chi-square is you use the same formula for all 3 of the chi-square tests. So one formula does everything. So to get a chi-square test statistic, we need a sum. We need to add some pieces, sort of tally up an amount of variation is what we're looking for. We look at the differences between the observed and expected values. How different are those observed numbers and expected numbers in our table? And then we square them to make them all positive. And then we divide by the expected, which is sort of as a proportional part. And then we sum those up. And the bigger this gets, the bigger those differences were, the more likely we are to reject a null. So I need to add some observed minus expected squared over expected. Okay. Well, I need my table. So let's go back and find the table. Kind of keep it handy. I'm going to fold it over here. So here's my table from the first step, and I need observed minus expected. So I've got in the first category an observation of 36, put it in parentheses, minus the expected frequency, which was 70. You're going to square it to make it positive, and then divide by the expected, which is 70. Just plug and chug. Plus, we're going to sum these. Then we're going to take the second frequency, which is 130, subtract what was expected, which is 102, square it, and divide by the expected 102. And add the third one, plus an observed 34 minus the expected 28, square it over the expected 28. If you have more than 4 categories, what would be expected is that you list the first 2, add, do ellipses, ... plus the last one to show how it ends. So the general rule of thumb is show the first 2 and the last. And you can skip anything in between because the pattern, we assume the pattern continues. Now, you could crunch that by hand, or you can let the calculator do it, which is what I prefer. And then we want the p-value. We're going to let the calculator compute this in just a minute, so let's go ahead and jot some things down. From that chi-square, we want to compute a p-value. Now, there are tables in the blue book, and we don't use those very often because we have this handy-dandy calculator that does just fabulous little things. But if we look at the last tables in the blue book, in the formula book, we see the chi-square test. There's the chi-squared picture. So 0 is the boundary, you have a hump, and then you have a long tail here, and the p-value is the probability of being in that shaded region, being greater than whatever that chi-square cut score is. And so we could look up using our degrees of freedom and our chi-square scores what our probabilities are in the table. Or we can let the calculator do it, which is what we're going to focus on that because it'll also give us the chi-square calculation at the same time. I'm looking for the probability of a chi-square score being bigger than whatever we have here, and that would be the p-value. It's always a greater than because it's a right-tailed test every single time. So let's check out what the calculator needs. So I have in my menu and statistics number 6 all kinds of stat tests as option number 7. So let's go to number 7 for stat tests, and after z tests and t tests I see chi-square GOF. That's the goodness of fit. So number 7 is the test that I need. And they asked me for 2 lists. Now you've got 2 options. One requires that you go back and do some prep work. You could open up a spreadsheet. In one column, put in your observations. In the second column, put in your expected values from the table. and then reference the names of your variables in your spreadsheet, and it would pull them from the spreadsheet. That's more work. So I'm just going to type them in right here. So what I have to remember is this is a set of numbers, okay? So before I type in my list of numbers from over here in the table, I have to put them in braces because it's a set. I have to use set notation. So on my calculator, if you go down this left-hand side, the right close parentheses has a second function, or in blue, of braces. That's what I need. So I'm going to do Control and the braces, the close parentheses button, and I'm going to build in some braces. Okay, we'll put this in our notes in just a minute. And I need to type in this observed list, 36, 130, 34, in order, separated by commas. So 36, comma, 130, comma, 34. Okay, so it's a set of numbers in a specific order. And then when I hit tab to go to the expected list, I'm going to do the same thing with these expected counts that I've already computed, because I had to compute those in order to check my conditions. So it's a matter of keying them in at this point. So Control, close parentheses for braces, and then 70, comma, 102, comma, 28 were the expected values. If you don't put them in braces, the calculator is going to give you an error message that's saying, I don't understand your language. It'll be a syntax error. So we want to make sure we make a note in our notes before we quit that those have to be in braces, or put them in a spreadsheet. Degrees of freedom, we have to input 2. We computed that ourselves. And there's the analysis. Notice it's really short and sweet. So the chi-squared value is 25.486-ish. Let's transfer that here. And so this is a 25.486 down here. And then the p-value is, that's a really big chi-square. So we don't really think of it as 25 standard deviations above the mean, because we're not measuring in standard deviations. But if the left end is 0, 25 is way the heck up at the right end, we think. And we can confirm that thought by looking at this p-value, 2.92 times 10 to the negative 6, so 0.000029, very, very close to 0. So this is 2.92 times 10 to the negative 6, which is very, very close to 0. That's very unusual. Probability of getting a sample this unusual, if the truth is really the percentages that were from the population. So we're going to reject the null, because we have a small p-value. Now let's make a couple of notes over here to the side. So to input values, use braces or spreadsheet. Braces, I think, are probably just a little faster, because you can do it all in one step. So that's the way that I will normally do things. Okay, so nice little note there. So really quick mechanics, and the calculator does the majority of the work in terms of, it does all the number crunching. We have no number crunching to do at all. Okay, so the conclusion, we know how to write this already, because we've been writing conclusions for months now. So we always start with a p-value, because we want a p-value and an alpha level and a link between the two to make a decision. So with a p-value of 0.00000292, we will reject the null hypothesis at any reasonable alpha level will do here. So I'm just going to use my traditional 5%. There is strong evidence. This is a really small p-value, so the evidence is quite strong. That, now I'm going to go back to last sentence in the problem stem about one or more age groups buying a disproportionate share of lottery tickets. And I'm just going to state that. I have evidence that that actually is happening. That one or more age groups buys a disproportionate proportionate share of lottery tickets. Now, there's one other little nifty thing that you get from chi-square tests that you don't get in other tests, and that's you can look at the individual components of this calculation up here. Each of these little pieces, each of these observed minus expected squared over expected, each of those are called components. And the biggest components are the ones that contribute to this overall chi-square value being large, which contributes to this p-value being small. So we want to know kind of where the biggest ones are. So we already suspected that the first two age groups were the different ones. But you can see what those actual components are with your calculator. So we're going to look at one new thing. This comp list at the very bottom, it actually computes each of the individual components, each of these individual pieces, and you can just take a look at them. So to reference those, you need to go to your variables key, which is right above the 9. VAR is for variables. Comp list is a variable, and your calculator saves anything in this list under a variable. So the very first option, because they're in alphabetical order, is the comp list. If I click on that and press enter, it'll give me the actual component list. So when you subtract 36 minus 70 and square it and divide by 70, you get 16.51. So that's the size of the first component. That's quite large. 7.68 is the middle one, and 1.285 is the smallest. A component of 0 would mean that the observations and the expectations match exactly, that these two numbers are the same. So components of 0 mean perfect match, and there's no evidence of there being any differences. Nothing interesting is going on. So the farther you get from 0, the more unusual your values are. So this value of 16.5, that's a really, really big difference. So it's that youngest age group that gives us the biggest component, gives us the biggest difference. So the youngest age group buys definitely fewer lottery tickets than what we would have expected. And the middle age group bought more. We can't really see that here because these are both positive, but the biggest component is going to be the biggest contributor to our rejection. So you can see where the big differences are. And to get a really strong conclusion, to comment on that would strengthen your conclusion. Or it might be a separate question that gets asked on an AP exam, is to talk about which component or components contributed the most to the differences, and it's going to be that youngest age group that's the kicker that did the most, had the most impact on making this a really small p-value so that we could reject the null. Okay, so there's chi-square goodness of fit test in a really tiny little package. It took a little while because it's a lot of new information. But from here, the next step is just to give it another practice run. So because candy is great and it makes it more fun to practice if you have candy, we're going to do the traditional M&M's chi-square test today. So everyone in the class has a little Ziploc baggie of M&M's, a random sample of M&M's. And in your small groups, you can combine your M&M's. That would give you more data, larger sample size, be more likely to get your expected counts where they need to be in order to run an inference procedure. So each person has their own individual baggies, but you might want to combine your M&M's with the other members of your group in terms of the counts. So tally up everybody's orange and everybody's red and everybody's brown and everybody's blue, and put those totals in your table, and then you all run the same numbers and you'll have a bigger sample size and a better inference procedure. That's what I would suggest. So I'm going to get you started, and then you're going to finish it in your small groups. Okay? So the M&M Mars Company claims that they're plain chocolate M&Ms. Okay, so the numbers are different for peanut and the crunchy ones and the pretzel ones and the peanut butter filled. A lot of those are illegal in the building, so we stay with the plain ones. But the plain ones are manufactured or produced in the following proportions: 13% are brown, 14% are yellow, 13% are red, 24% are blue, and so on and so forth. Is this true? Do you believe them? That's the question. Do you believe their claim? Do you trust them? So you're going to look at a sample of M&Ms, compare it, what's in your sample, to their claim to see if the claim is believable or not. So we're going to test their claim by examining a sample. So the null hypothesis always says there's nothing interesting going on. Okay, so for us that would mean that the proportions of colors are what the company claims they are, that the company is not lying, but we need to do that in context. So we'll say that the proportions of all colors, I like to squeeze that word all in there, it's the whole population, are what the company claims. And of course, for the alternative, we just stick a naught in there. So the proportions of all colors are not what the company claims. And you're going to compare your M&Ms to their claim to see if you believe that it's the same, they're null, retain it, or that it's different enough to reject and go with the alternative. Okay, so from there, before you check your conditions, you actually need to get some numbers, because remember, two of your conditions refer to the numbers. So in order to check your conditions that your data are counts, you need to actually count up your M&Ms and put them in your table. And you'll also need to calculate your expected counts so that you can check your third condition that the expected counts are all at least 5. And if you pull your numbers, if you combine all your numbers within your group, you shouldn't have any trouble meeting that expected counts are at least 5. So I'm going to turn you loose in just a second to finish this, and then I'll just walk around the room and make sure that you are on track and doing things that you should be doing. So calculate all your observed counts, and I would go ahead and just do a total after you finish with that, and then your expected counts are going to be that total, that sample size, multiplied by each of the percentages that the company claims back in the original question. Check your conditions, name your procedure, calculate your test statistics. So use the example that we just finished as a guide to do your mechanics. Use your calculator, write your conclusion, and we'll share some of those, because your results are going to vary from group to group. Every group is going to have different numbers, different observations, and different chi-square values and different p-values. It'll be interesting to see if we have groups that reject and groups that do not reject in the same classroom. Sometimes that happens. Okay, when you finish this, it'll be getting pretty close to time to go, so we're going to wrap it up by just skipping over to this next slide before I let go of you and let you do your thing, and just cover a couple of highlights. I've already mentioned that you only do hypothesis tests. There are never any confidence intervals. Hypotheses are in words. It considers all the hypothesized values together and gives an overall idea of whether the observed distribution differs from the hypothesized one. There's no such thing as a statistic that's too small, because you have a lower bound of 0 on your curve. A chi-square value close to 0 means that your observations match the expectations very, very closely, and you would fail to reject the null. And a large chi-square value means that the observed values do not match the model well, and you would reject the null. And if we reject the null, we should take a look at the components of the calculation. So go to that variables key and look at your component list. So variables key and look at your comp list for your components list, and see which cells, which of those values are dominant, which are the large ones and contributing most to your rejection. If we don't reject the null, there's nothing interesting going on, so there's no need to examine the computation list because they should all be close to, the components list should all be close to 0. So it's kind of like examining residuals. You want to see what the leftover stuff is, what the residue is. Small residue means a good match to your model. Large residue means something interesting is going on. And when you're all done with your M&M lab, the day 1 homework is page 698, numbers 3, 5, 7, and 11. All right, count your M&Ms.